Hello, welcome to another exciting and elucidating episode of the OmniTalk Ask an Expert series. I'm one of your co-hosts for today's interview, Ann Mazinga.
And I'm Chris Walton.
And we are the founders of OmniTalk, the fast-growing retail media organization that's all about the companies, the technologies, and the people that are coming together to shape the future of retail. Chris, I'm giving you a little bit of a gift. We'll call it an early Christmas gift with this LinkedIn Live event.
Oh, really, Ann?
I am, yes. Because I'm going to bridge two loves of yours. One, London.
Like yes.
London.
Yes.
Two is merchandising. And just a little sprinkle, if you will, of supply chain. Because, Chris,
so it's a threesome, man. You're giving me threesome. It's a trio.
Sprinkle.
It's a trio of love.
Yes, a sprinkle of supply chain. This session, Chris, is called Mind the Gap. And I'm expecting you at some point in time to do your British version of the tube station, Mind the Gap.
Mind the Gap.
Yeah, I don't know what that was, but close enough. But we're going to talk about just how important it is for retailers to make sure that those two sometimes siloed groups of a retail organization are collaborating. So to do this, we've called on two experts. Chris, we're bringing back SPS Commerce's VP of Customer Success, Brandon Pierre. We are joined by their new Senior Director of Customer Success for Retail, Mayan Kaplan, who are going to help our audience figure out how to get your supply chain teams and your merchandising teams working on the same sheet of music. So Brandon and Mayan, welcome to the show. Brandon, this is old hat for you. You've done this how many times now?
It's been a couple of times, but I'm super excited. I always enjoy the conversation, and thanks for having us. A topic that I'm very, very passionate about.
Is it London or the siloed merchandising supply chain teams coming together?
Great question. I would say it's more the merchandising and now supply chain side of the world for me.
Fair. Well, speaking of supply chain, Mayan, welcome to your first OmniTalk debut. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited. This topic is really important to me too. And again, talking more on the breaking the silos between merchandise and supply chain.
Excellent.
It's great to have you both. Brandon, I think this is your third, or at least your third time, maybe even your fourth time appearing on OmniTalk. So we're excited to have you back. And Mayan, it's great to have you here with us for the first time. So before we mind the gap, we want to give a quick reminder to those watching live on LinkedIn. Feel free to ask your questions of Brandon and Mayan at any time via the chat session window in LinkedIn to the right of your screen. All right, you two, you're on OmniTalk. So let me start out by saying there are no holds barred when you appear on OmniTalk. Mayan, you're going to be representing the supply chain side of a retail organization, and Brandon, you will be representing the merchandising side of a retail organization. So now I'm going to have you start but before we do that, before we pitch you one against another, I want you to each explain your backgrounds a little bit. Brandon, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so really, I grew up in retail. My family owns a retail business where I did a lot of buying for the family business. Spent 13 years at Target, primarily all in the merchandising, buying, planning side of the organization there. And from there, really came over to SPS. I've been at SPS now 9 years, and I know we'll get into a little bit about what SPS does. But big part of what we do is we work with aligning merchants with supply chain initiatives and then connecting that to their suppliers. So definitely come more and came into SPS with more of the merchant background and experience. But I've had a chance over the course of the last 9 years to better appreciate what's happening on the supply chain side and seeing some of the gaps that exist in these organizations.
Well said. Better appreciate what's happening on the supply chain side of the organization from the perspective of a merchant. Love that answer. All right, Mayan, why are you here representing the operational side or the supply chain side of the organization?
So throughout my career, I started in data and analytics, and I actually discovered supply chain throughout my career. I led organizations within supply chain, so demand planning, supply planning, and purchasing for both distributions and manufacturers. and I've joined SPS 3 months ago, so I'm brand new to the team, bringing in some of my thoughts and practices, leading again supply chain organization and sales and operation planning opportunities.
Well, Mayan, I'm really excited to have you on because of your background and the newness really to SPS. And I would want, if you don't mind, I would love to have you explain for the audience who may not be familiar what SPS does, especially as it pertains to our two topics du jour, supply chain and merchandising.
Yeah, and I actually gonna share it from the view of the customer. I was an SPS customer, and that's how I learned about
Mm,
SPS. So for us, as we were thinking about, okay, where can we add efficiency? Where do we see that our buyers are spending most of their time? And
hmm
where do we want them to spend time on? And we understood that there were a lot of manual activities and a lot of areas where they didn't add value as we needed them. So we started looking around and said, okay, where is this gap? And is it internally? Is it
Mm,
externally? And what exactly is causing that friction? And what we discovered is we want our buyers to spend a lot more time with the suppliers. We don't want them to, for example, enter data, right? We want them to have those conversations to solve shortages, to understand how can we expedite, how can we make sure that we have the right inventory at the right time and the right place. So as we were looking to understand what can help us, and how can we better connect with our suppliers, we found SPS Commerce and we kicked out a project to actually have a handshake both internally, so different organization internally and externally with the suppliers, so we can, in a way, automate non-value add activities so we can focus more on, okay, now the conversation about how can we both drive into one true north? How can now the conversation be, how can the supplier and us be more successful in achieving our goals? And what I actually discovered throughout the project is how much misaligned we were internally when we talked within supply chain and product management, or here we're calling the merchandise, right? Because product management or the merchant had the experience of talking more strategically with our suppliers, and our buyers were talking more tactically with the suppliers. So as we are looking to onboard a new community of suppliers into this program, we now need to work very closely on both aspects of the strategic side of supplier management and the tactical side of supplier management. And how can we actually enhance that internal relationship so we show up together to the supplier?
right. So there's a lot of meat on that bone that you just laid out in front of us. So I'm excited to get to it. So, and before we pitch you two against each other, some people are going to assume that as a lifelong merchant that I'm going to be automatically Team Brandon here, but I don't know. Hold the phone, folks, because like I got a lot of operation experience, both operator experience, both as a store field leader at Target and then also in inventory management at Gap too. So, and we've been doing this job for the last several years too, and supply
Right.
chain kind of an important thing. It's kind of an important
I,
thing to figure out and get right? Like for the most part
yes,
nowadays, right? Much more
yes,
so than it was
100%.
probably 10 or 15 years ago even. So Brandon, let's go to you first, the merchant. Where does a retailer need to start if they want to quote unquote mind the gap or bridge the divide between merchandising and supply chain operations?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple ways. One, it does feel like there's becoming more of a natural progression of supply chain and merchandising working together. And I think one of the biggest forcing
Mm-hmm.
factors there is the inventory side of things. As inventory is becoming much harder to manage and allocate across all the channels, it is forcing the merchants to have a better appreciation for how does my supply chain best perform? Because I can't just order more inventory
Mhm.
across the board. I have to make sure it gets to the right place at the right time. And it is forcing some of that collaboration. What I've seen some organizations do, and where I start to see the focus start to manifest in driving improvement, is they start to align around some key metrics. So
Mm.
obviously, something like an inventory position is pretty critical, But even as you drill a level deeper on something so simple as OTIFF, or on time in full, and it's a metric that I think has become a little bit of a buzzword across supply chain. And most merchants are like, oh, great, OTIFF, what does that mean? The reality is
it just the merchants? It might be the rest of us.
Sure. That's absolutely fair, but it's being able to connect the value of, well, when product shows up on time and it consistently shows up on time, how much better can I have my inventory allocated to the right endpoints? How can I promise inventory better to consumers online? Because that simple fact of knowing it's arriving on time. And then even things like, is it coming in full? And what's so fascinating is we roll out about 100 of these programs a year at SPS across retailers, where we're attempting to kind of modernize and automate their supply chain. And one of the number one things I hear from most merchants when we roll out one of the program is the data's wrong and the metrics are wrong. My fill rates aren't that bad. They can't possibly be that bad. And then we dive into it and they're like, oh no, actually that is accurate. I forgot I did cut that order with that supplier, or I forgot I did give them a 2-week extension. But because they're not focused on those metrics over time, it just creates delays in the supply chain. It creates inaccuracies, and all of that starts to compound in the ability to actually service the end consumer in the channels you need to. So I think some of it is just, it's a natural forcing function that's happening now amongst these organizations. But where I've seen some really start to lean in is the pinpointing around what the metrics are that we want to focus on, and then driving that collaboration inside the organization.
So Brandon, what is the general zeitgeist or the impetus for this kind of forcing mechanism as you described it? Like, is it the belief in like the omni-channel view into the inventory across the digital and the bricks and mortar divide? Is it, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, if I understand your question correctly, Chris, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, supply chain used to be looked at as a cost or minimizing cost and margin opportunity. Okay. And I think now it's being seen more as a growth opportunity or an accelerator opportunity that I not only as a merchant am now picking my item, but if I can actually align that to our supply chain capabilities, the item is almost just as important on how I can get that item to the end consumer in the various different channels. And so they're now starting to connect that more to growth than just purely a cost in managing the cost of moving the goods from across the supply chain.
Got it. So said another way, merchants you believe are starting to see supply chain as a point of differentiation for their product, as much as say like what the color of the shirt is, when you can give it to them, how you can get it to them is just as an important piece of differentiation.
Yeah, in the big challenge we see, and certainly one of the areas that was very interested in Mayan joining SPS, is Mayan was able to connect those dots between supply chain and merchants. But a lot of times supply chain is using terms and words like OTIFF that a merchant's kind of like, why do I care about that? And so while they are connected, it's almost like they operate in two different worlds in two different languages. And while they're attempting to maybe tackle some of the same things, they're not always able to pinpoint how those conversations come together. And so, again, that's a big part of, where we've seen advances there. You see more supply chain folks actually now taking on some responsibilities in merchandising in some organizations. But that's the gap that we're talking about, that minding the gap and making those connections.
Yeah. So Mayan, I'm curious then. So let's bring your side of your perspective into this discussion too. So where would you suggest the operations side of the organization start to get the merchants on board? In a lot of ways, I think is kind of my takeaway here. I'm probably not team merchant on this at the end of the day. What's your take?
So I'm going to introduce another concept. Brandon was talking about OTIFF. I'm going to talk about S&OP, which stands for Sales and Operation Planning, or the more mature ability, which is in IBP, which is Integrated Business Planning. And the idea is, how can we, as one company, have one true north and collaborate cross-functionally? So this process includes 5 steps. The first step is discussing your product. The second step is discussing demand planning. The third is supply planning, then financial planning. And at the end, you have executive review, where the C-suite is getting all that information understand where do we have gaps to achieve our financial goals? What activities do we need to do to close that gap? And now you have a true global view of your organization, of what product is wanted or going to be introduced to the market. What demand do we have? Can we actually achieve that demand with supply planning? Are we under? Do we have additional capacity that we can start saying, I understand the demand is X, but I'm underutilizing this place, this DC, this plant, this whatever service. Do you want to go and introduce the product to additional markets, right? Now you're having those true conversations of not only let's drop it across, right, over the fence to the supply chain, go deal with it. It's more supply chain now coming into the conversation and saying, okay, you want this product, I understand. Here is the cost associated with it. Or you only asking for this, but I have additional capacity. Do you want more? Those conversations don't happen as much in retail, as much as I might see more in manufacturing and distribution. I don't think S&OP and IBP has been introduced to retail. And I think this is a really great opportunity to break the silos and mind the gap by introducing cross-functional processes.
I think mine's getting some points on the board for team supply chain here with that answer. But mine, I want to dive a little bit deeper. I mean, this all makes sense, like going towards unified metrics that you're working off of. Seems like there's a lot more on the strategy side that supply chain can be doing. But what have some of the retailers, when you're going in and doing these programs like Brandon was talking about, what are some of the challenges that they're facing right now that are kind of getting in the way of them being able to do this?
Yeah, so as Brendan said, it's all about metrics, right? And let's think again about the gap between the two. When we think about the CMO, they think about revenue, right? They're much more on the sales side. When we think about the chief supply chain officer, they're much more on cash conversion cycles and finding ways to do as much saving as possible. So now you have two conflicting KPIs, right? That each department is following a different path.
Yep.
Now, let's say we have those two supplier scorecarding or metrics. If both organizations pick both of those metrics and understand, okay, so I understand why you're talking about cash conversion cycle, because you are accountable for day sales, and you are accountable for inventory on hand, and you are accounted for days payment outstanding, which are the components of the cash conversion cycle. And then the merchant understand how cash is so important for the business to enable that growth and enable additional opportunities of profit and revenue. So to me, talking about supplier scorecarding, understanding what are those metrics what are those targets, and how can the business can become that target points that they want to grow into, that's how we can enable them.
And Brandon, how do you think about this from the merchandising side here? Like what potential roadblocks have there been, or, as someone who's been in merchandising for as long as you have, like, it seems like there's a solution out here, but what's getting in the way?
Yeah, I mean, part of me is I've been pretty amazed at the lack of internal reporting that exists that can connect sort of the supply chain performance to the merchant's performance from a sales and margin standpoint. And I think merchants see a lot of data and a lot of analysis. I mean, you're getting a lot thrown at you from suppliers to, market share analysis to, marketing analysis. And then all of a sudden you start to hear these supply chain metrics that you need to care about. And it's some of the consistency to demonstrate to me, okay, if we're going to sign up for this new metric, help me see how that's changing over time, and then help me make that connection to what that's doing to drive growth in sales, in margin, or market share for me, and starting to make those connections. And that's where I will come to the defense of the merchants. Like, it's not because they're ignorant or idiots. Like, they do want to drive this, but I have so many different ways in which I can pull the levers. Why is this the one I should prioritize? And that's where I hold some of the supply chain folks accountable to. Don't throw a bunch of metrics and measurements at me that I don't understand. Connect that back to the thing I care about, and I will drive that. But that consistency in being able to do that is where I see some of the gap in these organizations. And I mean, that's a real challenge. They're operating in different systems sometimes. That can create some challenges to being able to do that. But that is where I will come to the defense of the merchants. They typically tend to be rational. If you show them something that says how it can improve their performance, they'll do it. They'll lean into it, but you got to be able to show it to them.
Oh man, that's great. So basically what you're saying, it's a leadership and a management, issue here in a lot of ways too, between across the junction between supply chain and merchandising leadership and their management tactics. So, but Brandon, I want to put your feet to the fire a little bit. And by the way, I question whether anyone ever needs to come to the defense of the merchants, given their traditional roles inside an organization. But with that said, I want to put your feet to the fire here, because what you both are talking about, I think anyone watching here, and, for those watching live, let me know if you agree. But I think generally people are probably buying into what you're saying, that we need more alignment across metrics and communication and strategies between the two orgs. But how do you actually do it? So Brandon, what have you seen that's crucial for success to get this implemented?
Yeah, I mean, I would say a lot of it starts with a focus. There's so many different areas you could go and tackle. When you talk supply chain and supply chain performance, I mean, it can almost be it can be paralyzing a bit when you look at all the different areas you can touch. And I do think really, where I've seen organizations start to be able to accelerate some change here is really looking at the interaction between them and their suppliers, and those points of interaction they have with their suppliers, and kind of saying, where is it that we have some disruption in the way in which we work across our supply chain and how we connect with suppliers? Is that on our receiving process? Is that on our ordering process? Could it be even further upstream on are we poor at our planning process so our suppliers don't even know what we're bringing them? Where is it that we're struggling a bit here? And pick off one of those key points, and then start to hone in on, well, okay, how have we set the expectations with our suppliers? Have we set the appropriate expectations internally? And being able to look at that analysis across their industry and market to say, hey, we're operating with 2-week lead times on most of our orders, where the reality is most of our competitors are planning 4 weeks out or 6 weeks out. And maybe that's part of where the pain is with us and the suppliers. So it's kind of taking a look at those connection points into the suppliers, seeing where those biggest areas of pain are, focusing in on 1 or 2 of those, and then looking at it through the lens of, have I been clear internally around what our expectations are, and are those consistent? And then have I communicated that out to the supplier? And then I can start to drive the performance improvement in those areas. But when we see organizations try to go too broad and too fast all at once, you lose focus. And when I see it only internally, but it not necessarily incorporate how the suppliers are going to need to operate, you also see it fail.
That's a great point, especially because in supply chain, you can almost measure anything too, right? You can almost overload yourself with data if you're not careful. I'm curious, so Brandon, in your history or in your experience, which is pretty extensive at this point, are there any 1 or 2 or 3 key metrics that you would tell people, yeah, if you probably focus on this, it's probably going to help you, particularly if you're starting from ground zero in this conversation?
Yeah, well, it is that on time in full.
That one.
And I mean,
OTIF.
there are some.
For those
OTIF, yes.
Yeah.
OTIF.
Yes.
Yeah. I got an OTIF in my back, actually, Adam. Yes.
I did not realize I was breaking that term out. I've become immersed in supply chain that it just has become a natural for me. But no, that on time in full, there's so many things that stem from that and levers you can. If I know my suppliers are consistently shipping me on time, then I might be able to start to work with my ship windows with them. Am I ordering 2 weeks in advance, but they're always shipping me on time? Can I maybe talk to them about, could we do that a week in advance and still see that? That allows me to be more flexible in how I'm responding to sales performance. Things like, And, is it coming in full? And if they're shipping me 50% of my product every time, and I don't know that until it comes into my distribution center, well, I'm sitting on expecting this inventory to come in, and I'm likely not buying replan, or I haven't invested in some other product. And so it's pretty basic when you get there.
Yeah.
But that metric, you can do so much when you're able to drive that up. And again, Chris, this is where I've said, like, when we've started to measure this with organizations, they're shocked at the current state of what that looks like.
Right.
They're just, especially merchants, they constantly will say, that's wrong. And it's like, no, you actually exempted that supplier, and you didn't even realize how much that would impact the downstream supply chain. So OTIF is probably the one that it incorporates a couple things. It's the on time and it's the in full. And if you can create better performance in those two, there's so much you can do in pulling down inventory levels, cutting down some lead times, and improving the throughput when you do receive it. You're able to now not sit on inventory that you didn't know was coming, and now all of a sudden you're moving it through your DCs or your back rooms or your stores much faster.
Got it. So OTIF is the acronym of the day then, I guess. That's my big takeaway from this webinar. And it brings up the point too about including the suppliers in that conversation as well. Like if you don't do that, you're going to miss out on the importance of this metric aligning your organization as well. So Mayan, I'm curious, any color you would add to this discussion, any additional metrics you would add into the mix?
Yeah. Team supply chain. Let's hear what you have to say, Mayan.
So for me, again, OTIF is something that I've implemented in any organization I joined. It's my first step to understand what should be my action plan. Because you start with a number and you say, okay, is this number good or bad? And then you say, okay, what number do I want to get to? And what is my 5-year plan? And then you go to, okay, so if today, let's say I'm on 80, and in 5 years, I want to get to 98, because you can't get 100. 100 means infinity of inventory.
Yeah.
If you want to close that gap, what actions do you need to take? Do you need to increase your forecast accuracy? Do you need to increase your supplier on time? Do you need to increase your output from your DCs? And I can give so many examples as a customer where I've ordered 5 packs of batteries. I got 5 boxes in separate days of batteries. Me as a customer receiving 5 boxes is just a waste, right?
Right.
But the retail that sent it to me wanted to get me the product as fast as possible. Now, again, you go into a very different conversation of what is the in full that the customer is actually looking for? Is in full for them as soon as possible, or in full for them is packaged together when you have everything available for me, then ship it. There's so much detail you can go in it. Now, OTIF is really great, but how I can also connect between the merchant and supply chain is the cash conversion cycle, because the merchant is really key to the sales outstanding and the payment outstanding, right, in their relationship. And then when you talk about supply chain, it's inventory outstanding, right? So now you have those financial KPIs that you can use together as 2 organizations discussing with finance and with the CEO to say, here is how we as an organization better manage our cash and capital, right?
Yeah, it sounds like everybody's benefiting from that. If you can do what you and Brandon are talking about, Mayan, which is work off a similar metrics, or at least use goals like OTIF to start out with to get on the same page, and then to start to look at, how you combine really like your KPIs or what's driving the growth of the business in merchandising and in supply chain. I also like the customer perspective. And I'm curious, Mayan, like you mentioned, as a customer, do I want to get 5 individual boxes or 1 box with 5? Do you find that there's interest on the retailer side now to have visibility, because it's, yes, less money for me as a retailer to ship this product, but also my consumers' expectations are changing as to, what's the more sustainable option, or, what's happening? Like, is that playing into some of the retailers' investments in some of these these strategies.
Absolutely. And you'll hear the subject of sustainable supply chain coming up a lot, right? And
Yeah.
it's part of it as well, is not only thinking how you within your organization is managing those expectations, but what is the supplier expectation and what is the
Right.
customer expectation? I can switch that battery example to say, okay, the supplier now shipped me 5 boxes of those batteries. I need to open 5 boxes. I need to
Right.
put them on the shelf. I need
Right.
to do all those activities 5 times instead of I got one box with consolidated material, for example. So
Right.
any example that I give on the customer side, you can flip it on the supplier side, because at the end of the day, the retailer becomes the customer of the
customer.
supplier.
Right.
Great point.
Right. Right. Oh, well, I wanna kind of start to close out the conversation with planning ahead for next year. The teams listening to this on this live event today are deep in the throes of kind of getting ready for 2025. So, Brandon, I'd love to go to you first. Like, what's your advice for them as they kick off some of these initiatives that we've talked about today, or try to kind of bridge the gap between their supply chain and merchandising teams?
Yeah, I think I mean I'll give a couple of thoughts there. So first off, I would challenge people to on this term that we brought up, which is the term of the day apparently, OTIF. If you don't know how your suppliers are shipping you from an on-time perspective, why not? Why I would challenge you on why don't you care about that? And if you are looking at that, have you set a goal towards what good should be? And how did you arrive at what that goal of good should be? And have you communicated that to your suppliers? And then you look at and in full. And are they actually shipping me in full? And again, if you're not measuring that, why not? And what does good look like? Because the OTIF concept brings those things together, and it kind of creates that perfect marriage of it. But it starts with, if you're not measuring it, why not? And even if you are, what does good look like, and how are you communicating that out to other parties in your organization as well as your suppliers around what the expectations are? The other thing is, if OTIF in that measurement piece feels too big, as you're thinking about planning for next year, this might be the kumbaya of mine and I coming together, but it does, in my opinion, the merchant team should sit there, and at some level of leadership, sitting down with the supply chain team and saying to the supply chain group, what is the biggest disruption that goes on in the supply chain today that keeps you from moving the goods through the supply chain as fast as possible? Just start with that question. And then from there, you can start to figure out, okay, what's my role in that? Oftentimes merchants don't even realize they play a role in what that disruption is. And then you can start to take that one big thing and start to unpack it and look at that. So, and on the supply chain side, they need to be invested in what the merchant strategy is. What are the big categories you're going after? What are the channels? Am I set up for success to do that? Now, the best organizations are likely having that planning conversation at a high level, but I do think just even that intimate, let's sit down and talk about it, is critical for both parties.
I mean, Brandon, I think what you need to do is at NRF start handing out T-shirts from SPS's booth that say your OTIF is off, and we can help you find it. And then they can wear that when they get back to their offices after NRF, and then they can start that conversation.
I'm more of a quarter zip guy, Ann, but
quarter zip guy.
You know what? Quarter zips.
Yeah.
Why
or
would I say
ball? Whatever works.
yes?
Yeah.
Why would I say T-shirt? Quarter zips are truly making a comeback. It's the 90s reboot. Brandon, of course, quarter zips. Mayan, what would your advice be for the listeners here as we wrap up?
So I would just repeat what Brandon said. Just meet together cross-functionally, align on one true north. What is the metric that cross-functionally will move us forward? And then set up action plan toward it. We are recommending is OTIF. And if it is, then understand what each of those departments needs to do, right? It's not let's set up OTIF and our supply chain need to go and do all the work. It's how do we educate both sides and assign activities for both sides to improve so we can continuously improve as an organization and achieve the growth that we set up.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to close on. The way I'd sum up what you guys both just said too is like the first step is, what is good, right? You got to define what good is. And then the next question, which I think is interesting too, is how good is your good, which is a phrase that we love at OmniTalk. Like, how good is your actual good? And that's the point of defining, what you want that metric ultimately to be, And so it's a very good way to wrap this conversation up. So thank you both. It was a real pleasure to have you join us today. If people want to get in touch with either of you, what's the best way for them to do that? Mayan, why don't you start?
Yeah, for me, you can email me to my SPS email, which is mkaplan@spscommerce.com. You can send me a message on LinkedIn. It's /Mayan K, or you can go into our website, spscommerce.com.
Awesome. Brandon?
Please find me on LinkedIn. Seems to be the easiest way to network and connect across all of us folks across retail. Otherwise, you can find me via email at brpierre@spscommerce.com, or else SPS will have a booth at NRF. It's booth 6757, and I will be there, mine will be there, and we'd love to pick up the conversation there as well.
Awesome. Well, that wraps us up. Hopefully everyone watching will never forget the acronym OTIFF ever again. It'll always be top of mind. Thanks to Brandon Pierre and Mayan Kaplan of SPS Commerce for sitting down with us today. And thanks to all of you that joined us live on LinkedIn. As always, on behalf of all of us at OmniTalk, on behalf of Ann and myself, be careful out there.